I want to talk a little bit today about the slave trade in Bristol because, of course, Bristol has been in the news lately in connection with the slave trade. I was hugely amused to see the toppling of the statue in Bristol because, okay, if I talk about the slave trade in Bristol, I'm guessing immediately that 99.99% of people watching this will be thinking about black slaves because that's what Bristol's famous for. I don't suppose one person in 1,000 realises that the slave trade in Bristol was a lot more ancient than the transatlantic slave trade, and that actually about 700 years before black slaves started to be transported across the Atlantic, there was a thriving slave trade in Bristol. The trade was in white English slaves, of course, which not many people seem to realise. Bristol became established as a slave trading centre roughly in the 10th century, that's 900 and something, and it was used a lot by Viking traders. During the Anglo-Saxon period, that's before the Norman Conquest, 800, 900, up to 1066, roughly 10% of the people in England were slaves, and they were moved about and bought and sold like cattle. There was also an international trade in them. They were exported to other countries, and that was under the control of the Vikings. The Irish city of Dublin, the capital city of Ireland, was actually founded by the Vikings as a slave trading centre. So slaves were exported from Bristol and then shipped to Dublin, and from Dublin they were taken to Africa and other places, for example Scandinavia. So Dublin and Bristol were both heavily involved in the slave trade long before there was any thought of exporting African slaves across the Atlantic. This is something which not many people realise. I'm sorry that not many people have heard about this, but there's not very much I can do about that. A lot of people in the West have been indoctrinated with the idea that slavery means black people, and talking about white slaves almost sounds like a contradiction in terms for a lot of them. I will cheerfully email a list of sources on this subject to anybody that asks for it, and if people don't want to put their email address on YouTube, they can always go onto my website at simon-web.com, and you can send me an email there, and I will be only too happy to send a list of sources on this subject. There's really no excuse for not knowing about it, or there's certainly no excuse for accusing me of making it up. I see on some comments people have put things like 100% bullshit and I'm dreaming it and so on. A lot of this is freely available, even on Wikipedia. I realise Wikipedia is not what you would describe as an academic source, but it's certainly the place to which most people turn when they first want some information. If anybody wants to go on Wikipedia and look at the article History of Bristol, and then look at the section dealing with Anglo-Saxon times, they'll find an account of Bristol as a slave trading centre before the Norman Conquest. Similarly, if they want to know a little bit more about it, they can go on to Wikipedia again and look at the article Slavery in Britain, and then look at the subsection before 1066. There's really no secret about any of this, and there's really no excuse either for not being aware of it. Most of the history taught in the West has been so distorted that many people don't really understand their own heritage, and this is especially so for the British and Irish. The Irish have got a grudge, obviously, against the English for historic reasons, for being mistreated in the past. But we might try and remember that cities like Dublin, Limerick and Waterford were founded as slave trading centres, and the slaves that were dealt with there were English slaves. So Ireland has a history of exploiting England long before there was any suggestion that England was exploiting Ireland, of course. something isn't known, and I find this literally incredible. We often hear, or a lot of black people believe, that their identity, their history, their sense of being, political consciousness is bound up with the experience of slavery, the fact that their ancestors were slaves. The British black MP David Lammy has mentioned a number of times that his ancestors were slaves. It's an important thing. People never seem to realise that the very concept of Englishness is inextricably bound up with the experience of the English as slaves. Now, the earliest historian of the English was a Venerable Bede, but he didn't start off, when he was writing his history, referring to the English. He talked about the Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons and so on. He didn't start talking about the English as a separate identity before he related an anecdote about Pope Gregory, and this was in the 6th century. Pope Gregory was walking through Rome when he came across a slave market, and he saw some very beautiful children there. They were fair-haired, very white-skinned, and he remarked how beautiful they were and asked the owner, the slave trader, where they came from, and he remarked that they were English. He said they were Angli, meaning English. Pope Gregory then made a very clever pun in Latin. He said, non Angli sed angeli, not English, but angels. It's only after telling this anecdote that the Venerable Bede starts talking about the English as a special identity. Now this is curious. It tells us firstly that the English were indeed being traded as slaves long before, well, about 1,000 years before England became involved in the transatlantic slave trade, in fact. It also tells us of the importance of this to the English identity. The same thing applies, obviously, to the Irish. I say obviously because, again, many people may not realise this. Not only were most of the main Irish cities slave trading centres to begin with, the patron saint of Ireland, St Patrick, wasn't Irish. He was English. He'd been picked up by slave raiders in England and transported to Ireland. The other well-known saint in Ireland, St Bridget, was the daughter of slaves. So for Irish identity as well, slavery is very important. All this was 1,000 years, as I say, before England became involved with the transatlantic slave trade. There were individual slavers, but it wasn't until after the end of the English Civil War in the 1650s that England really became a slave trading nation. I'm going to be talking more about this in the future, but for the time being, I'd be very happy if anybody who feels they might benefit from spreading this, if anyone feels perhaps that some of the people talking about Bristol at the moment are ignorant of its past. If anyone wants to send a link of this video to anywhere, I'd be perfectly happy for that to be done. This is a fairly short video because I'm very busy. I write books. This YouTube channel is only by way of being a hobby, as one might put it. But anyway, I hope to be back again before too long. Cheerio.